I've always been captivated by the night sky. I remember as a younger version of myself lying in the grass looking up at the stars. Then as I've grown a little bit older, my body didn't do the lying in the grass thing so well anymore. I'd sit in a chair and look skyward. And at one point, I even used a telescope to view the patterns of the stars. But whichever way I viewed the stars, I've always been amazed. Recently, I spent a couple of nights at a spiritual retreat in northern Indiana. Luckily, the skies had been cloudless all day, and by nightfall, the sky was alight with stars. One of the highlights of the trip was me lying on my back on a picnic table and trying to find all the constellations without the intrusive lights that my suburban home near Indianapolis have. I could clearly view the Milky Way, the Big Dipper, the Small Dipper, Canis Major, that's the dog, Orion, Scorpius, and other constellations. In fact, I was so enamored that I ended up staying out much later in the evening than I normally do these days. It was nearly midnight when I ended my day, just so I could ponder the night skies. The vastness of the heavens allow one's imagination to run rampant. And speaking personally, I think that they are beautiful beyond measure. The poet Henry Wadsworth wrote, "Silently, one by one, in the infinite meadow of heaven, blossom the lovely stars, the forget-me-nots of the angels." I know stars some, but my ancient forebears knew the night sky literally like the back of their hands. The constellations oriented them in literal sense as navigational tools, but also in a spiritual sense, serving as a reminder of their mythologies and their place in the universe. And for me, they're still a source of knowledge and humbling awe. I want to illustrate how long people have been fascinated by the night skies by sharing with you what the prophet Ptolemy said in the 2nd century, who mapped out 48 constellations. His first written account of the constellations was at that time and had been used as a benchmark for centuries. Although it was in the 2nd century, understand that the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Nordics, and the Celtic people have been driven by the night sky as well. In fact, as long as people have been around, the night skies, the stars, have been a place people pondered their place and it guided their decisions. The problem is, in our modern times, or at least where I live, it's difficult to get a good view of the illuminated heavens because of the light pollution. You know what that is, right? It's the artificial light projected all around us, which inhibits the full viewing of the night skies. I recently read an article that said some cities are trying to reduce artificial light pollution by enabling people to see the stars in the vastness of the night sky. In a parallel observation, the Apostle Paul encourages us to cut down the things that prevent us from seeing and pursuing the bright light of Christ. If you've ever spent the night in a desert, or up on a mountain, or some other remote area far from human habitation, one of the things that immediately catches your attention will have been the brilliant array of stars in the night sky. Out there, the Milky Way is not a candy bar, but a visible and seemingly infinite band of stars and planets that cause many observers to contemplate their finitude. One can feel quite small standing in the vast and expanding universe of God's creation. Contrast that experience to, say, glancing up at the night sky as you exit your local shopping mall while actually munching on a Milky Way. You might see the moon and maybe a few brighter constellations, but the darkness is not visible there enough for you to be able to see the vast majority of the stars. So instead of contemplating life on your way home, you're thinking about how many calories were in that Milky Way. Artificial light has become such an ubiquitous part of modern life that 2/3 of the world's population lives in an area where light pollution obscures the night sky. That's sad. We light up everything from parking lots to construction lots, from backyards to schoolyards. And according to the International Dark Sky Association, most of that light is unnecessary and actually wastes $2.2 million annually. No mention to the effect it has on human beings and the environment. There are additional problems besides light pollution keeping you from seeing the night stars, and 2012, for example, the American Medical Association reported that widespread use of artificial light messes with your rhythms of the human body, leading to many destructive diseases and disorders. Animals are affected as well because light pollution causes disruptions in their sleep patterns, their migration, and their mating. In the interest of pushing back the darkness for reasons of commerce and security, we're actually damaging our environment as well as our sense of being citizens of a larger galaxy. So if you want to do some stargazing, you need to get out to some of those remote places that still exist while they still exist. You know, light pollution in many ways is a classic example of the human way of doing things that causes us to miss the bigger picture by focusing only on what's in front of us. In the interest of being more productive, more efficient, safer, and more secure, we are more than happy to flip on the switch, but we don't realize the negative effects that things like 24-hour lighting have on us. Sure, I mean, being able to see at night's a good thing, but is it the best thing in the end? Is there an advantage to letting some things in our life so dark for a while that we can see and experience even greater things in ourselves and in the world? It's a curious thing. You need to have darkness to see the light. Now, I don't know if the Apostle Paul was a stargazer. Certainly, he didn't deal with much light pollution as he traveled around the first century Roman world, where the oil lamp and occasional campfire was probably about all the humans could generate. So, no doubt he spent many nights sleeping under the stars looking up at the vastness of the universe. For Paul, however, there was only one light that shone so brightly that it made everything else in his life seem dark and insignificant by comparison. Paul wrote to the Philippians from the darkness of a Roman prison, where he might have seen the stars only through the bars of his cell, yet even in the darkness of his suffering and imprisonment, Paul's letter is illuminated with joy, a joy found in what he calls the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus. Paul's joy and the illumination of God's revelation in Christ were only made visible in Paul's life after he switched off the other lesser lights, those things that have dominated his world up to that point. Before being dazzled and blinded by the presence of a risen Christ on the road to Damascus, Paul had relied on the bright spots of his resume as a Pharisee to light his path. He had more than enough reason to be confident in the flesh as a zealous defender of the law of Moses. He was circumcised on the 8th day, he said, according to the law, and he grew up an Israelite in the tribe of Benjamin. He was a Pharisee, a zealous persecutor of the church, and blameless. In other words, Paul was a shining example of a pious Jew who could light up a room with a fire of a zeal for God and the law. But when Paul was blinded by the light of the risen Christ, all those lesser lights went dark for him. He says, whatever gains I had, I have come to regard as lost of Christ. In fact, everything else in Paul's life got switched off so that he could fully experience the surpassing value of knowing Jesus Christ as Lord. Those other lights of confidence, zeal, law-abiding blamelessness, Paul had considered as unnecessary lights that had to be scrapped in order to capture the larger, expansive vision of the incomparable Christ, whose stunning purity could be his, not from obedience to the law, but through faith. The Pharisee who made others suffer now wanted to know Christ and his sufferings, sharing the power of his resurrection and becoming like him in his death. Paul was willing to experience the darkness of prison, the darkness of suffering, the darkness of death, because he now believed Christ's resurrection from the dead was the ultimate light breaking in on the world. The resurrection of Jesus wasn't like a candle lit in the corner pushed back into a little darkness to go away, but it was more like the sun coming up at dawn, illuminating the whole world. Paul was willing to let everything else go dark to capture the vision of Christ's ultimate resurrected light. He hadn't yet attained the goal, but was pressing toward it because Christ had made his own known. All the previous lights he had relied upon were now switched off so the apostle could press on toward the goal for the prize of the heavenly call of God. You might say that Paul was launching his own version of the dark sky movement, encouraging the church in Philippi to be of the same mind, joining and imitating him and his fellow missionaries, observing those who live according to the example you have in us. There are plenty of lesser lights that capture and cause us to miss the bigger picture of Christ. We can easily get caught up in our own spiritual resumes like Paul had done. Or we can rely on even more insidious light like our past sins, which often shine so brightly that its memories blind us to the reality of God's grace in Jesus. We might rely on things like church attendance or good deeds or simply being good people, but these little candles, in comparison to the illuminating life of the resurrected Christ, just don't cut the mustard. That's a life that requires willingness to enter into the darkness of suffering love for Christ and for others so that we can see and experience the vastness of God's redemptive plan for the whole cosmos. That was illuminated when Christ rose from the dead. What suffering in darkness have you walked through in order to become like him? What darkness of suffering are you willing to walk through? When we turn off the lights, as it were, that is, realize what it is truly important in our lives and what is simply trash, as Paul calls it, we may see Jesus emerge as a star of our night sky, a star that brightens any gloom and dreariness we may experience. As I mentioned earlier, the International Dark Sky Association encouraged us to turn down the light so that we might not only be healthier, but that we might see the full goodness of God's vast creation. When we're willing to turn down and tone down all those things that prevent us from experiencing the light of Christ's resurrection in our own life, we not only become healthier spiritually, but we also find the ultimate purpose and goal of our life. Jesus himself says it to us like this: "It is I, Jesus, the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. The Spirit and the bride say, 'Come.' Let everyone who hears come. Let everyone who is thirsty come. Let anyone who wishes to take the water of life as a gift come." Anyone who wants to see the illumination of Christ must be in more darkness. This is the word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God.